So I've called this "The Writing is on the Wall" because that's kind of a phrase that you may hear even in today's, lingo, because it has to do with, some foreboding outcome that is assured, for you, and it's kind of a warning. The writing is on the wall. You better beware. But it does come from this chapter, really, where Belshazzar is having a feast. He's the king of Babylon. He is a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king in these previous chapters. And we've seen the outcome of his situation, where he lets his power and prestige, cause pride to grow in his heart, and it causes him to, of course, rebel against the true God of heaven. And he gets brought low in humility because of his pride. Well, his descendant here, Belshazzar, is really not learning the lesson about it. And so the whole idea of this chapter is that God gives a supernatural vision, not a vision, but a supernatural handwriting that appears on the wall. And actually you can see a hand writing certain things on the wall, and that's what the king sees, and it causes great consternation. And the king, about his pride in this, and the central root of his problem here that's going to cause his condemnation. And this is what we want to learn from it, that we need to guard ourselves against human pride and rebellion against God, and always try to recognize him as the ultimate value, the ultimate source of objective morality and value. That's what this is going to be about. So there was a popular painting by Rembrandt, the handwriting on the wall. So I don't know if you can see that very well, but that's what that's about. It just shows that the scene, Belshazzar there in the middle, and he's looking over on the wall, and you see a hand up here, and then the characters that are written there on the wall. And we'll talk more about those in a later class, about what does that mean, the writing that's on the wall and the meaning of it. This is a close-up of the writing. And so we know later on in the chapter that it says mene, tekel, and upharsin, and that is Aramaic that has to do with weights and measures. And the idea is that we're all going to be weighed in the balances, so to speak. In other words, we'll give an account of ourselves. And the question is, will we be found wanting? And will we be found condemned? And that's what the message was for Belshazzar. You have been weighed in the balances, but you've been found lacking. And we don't want to hear that. But that's what many people will hear, because they don't recognize and respect the true God. He's the one that gives us life and gives us laws and gives us purpose. And when we seek all of that in him, we will be truly fulfilled. We'll be truly content and have a peace that passes understanding, that kind of thing, and be able to face the challenges in life, with faith. And that's what God wants for us. He wants we rob ourselves of those blessings through our selfishness and our pride. And that's what Belshazzar learns on this occasion. Him and his beautiful wife there sitting next to him. That's a joke if you could see the picture. Okay, so that's the idea there about the whole point of the chapter. And we basically only got into the first 4 verses that talks about Belshazzar making a great feast. And the issue now is that his conduct at this feast shows disrespect for God, and it shows a prideful disposition in his own heart, so that he can show off so that he can promote himself in this feast. The way that he shows disrespect for God is that he calls for the gold vessels. Now there's feedback in that speaker. Anyway, he shows disrespect for God by bringing in the gold vessels from the temple. So this was God's temple over in Jerusalem, and Nebuchadnezzar had taken those when he plundered Jerusalem, and he had brought them back to his own storehouse and set them up as trophies of his victories, that he defeated the God of Israel. And so that was the whole idea of these vessels being set up in the trophy case of Nebuchadnezzar. And now his great-grandson or whatever, Belshazzar, is throwing a feast, and he calls for these gold vessels. But they're not, he's calling so he can drink out of them, so that he can use them for his own. All of this is a great picture of how many times we see the world behaving toward God. They want to use God for their own ends, for their own glory. And they want to shape God into what they want him to be for them. And it's not. So this is what we learn from the chapter. I may have somebody to read. Carter, would you mind reading? I'll read verse 4 that says, "They drank wine and praised the God." This is what Belshazzar was doing in his feast, drinking out of the gold vessels of God that was supposed to be used in his service, representing, of course, the true standard of right and wrong. And they're flippantly using them. And they're praising false gods that cannot save. So the story goes, Carter, if you'll read verses 5 through 9, please.
Plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler of the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king their interpretation, or king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed.
So what I have here is kind of on the outline number 2 there. In his mind, he sees something, obviously a miraculous situation going on the wall across the room. And it causes, his knocking knees, right? His knees knocked against each other. Shows that he's terrified because he's beginning to recognize that this is a foreboding. Something is not right. And I don't know if you've ever, I know we've all been afraid from time to time, or we know the experience of fear. There's such a thing as a fear of roller coasters, and then there's such a thing as a fear. This is a different kind of fear again, altogether. It's the fear of the otherworldly, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the eerie, that you realize there is a reality there, but it's so enigmatic, but it's so near that but this, of course, is a fear that anybody who's going to be saved and come to the true God of heaven has to experience to some degree. It's like what we say, before you respect the good news of the gospel, you have to first recognize the bad news of your sin and what that really means. And so that's a numinous fear. So I described that a little bit in letter B there at the middle of the page. It says the experience of numinous. And this would be, for example, the difference between the fear of a lion and the fear of a ghost. Now today, to say the fear of ghost, nobody really believes that there's a ghost there. So it's more like a fear of a ghost story or something. But I'm saying, what if you were convinced, honestly, that there is an unseen being really there from the other world? I mean, that's a different kind of fear than saying, okay, I'm in the room with a lion. Now, they're both fear, but there's a way different kind of fear that you will have. And that's what we're talking about here. That's true. He's terrified of the numinous. And I say here, it's not mere fear, but it's more like a dread, a fear of the uncanny, the unlimited mystery. In other words, you just begin to feel your smallness, and yet the imminence of some terrible fate that is about to befall you, even though you can't put your finger on it. So I don't know if I'm overplaying that. I don't know much of anything right now, but I think you see the importance of why I'm trying to press this. This is not just, Nebuchadnezzar waking up and go, man, I had this dream that bothers me and I can't figure out why it really bothers me. Somebody come and tell me how great I am. That's basically what he was wanting to do. And so he got his people around him and tried to be sure and tell me, make sure it ends with good news about me because I know I'm the great, that kind of thing. No, this is him going, whoa, something is terribly wrong here and I'm in trouble somehow and I don't even understand why, So I say here that we all, like Belshazzar, have a capacity for numinous fear or awe. Now, there are a few passages in the Bible that I think speak to this in a manner. If you knew the flow of Ecclesiastes, you'd see why this would be speaking, I think, directly to this idea. But it says that He, that is God, has set eternity in their hearts. That is in the hearts of men, not animals, as the chapter will distinguish, but of men and women. So what does it mean that God has set eternity in their hearts? This world, animal and men. We are the only ones that can have a concept of the abstract in our minds. We can think abstractly. We can reason that way because God created us to be able to do that. He has set eternity in their hearts, except that no one can find out the work that God does from beginning to end. That's the rest of the verse. See what that means? Is that we can know the concept of, to say eternity, as that verse says. We can understand that concept, but have you ever really tried to think about, running the gamut of that in your mind? Something that never had a beginning and never has an ending. It begins to cause us to shrink in our self-introspection about how awe-inspiring that is. Of course, there's only one eternal being. There's nothing else eternal except God. Father, Son, and Spirit. One God, three persons, that in our hearts in such a way that we can experience a shrinking feeling in His presence or in these truths that is supposed to cause us to fall down before Him and ask, what must I do? How might I approach the Almighty God? With what shall I come before the mighty God and bow before the Holy? In the world do we approach that? Well, that's what all the Bible is about. It's about, you can't approach that. God has to be the one that breaks that barrier, and He has done so. In all of His work in history, and ultimately in sending His Son to walk among us, to show us that, yes, we are but infinitesimal specks on an infinitesimally small speck of rock in the entire universe, but we are extremely important to Him. And He wants us desperately to, I don't know if desperately is the right word, He wants us sincerely to be in fellowship with Him because He loves us that much. And all of that should blow our minds. Psalm 8, what is man that you are mindful of him? Or the Son of Man that you visit him? You have made him a little lower than the angels and crowned him with glory and honor. Made him to have dominion over the works of your hands, the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, the fish of the sea. I mean, out of all of that, David is contemplating looking up into the sky and saying, we are just seemingly nothing in this vast creation, and yet God loves us so much and has condescended to suffer with us and redeem us. And the question is what will be our response to that? Will it be our thoughts and our minds in order to receive that grace and say, what must I do to be saved, and then obey whatever God says to do? Or will it be a sweeping of it under the rug, saying, for whatever reason, it blows my mind and it blows Diane's mind, why people would ever do that. But people do that. And they just deceive themselves continually, and till it's too late for many. And that's an unfortunate thing. Is steeped in his idolatry and his self-importance, constructing a standard of morality according to his own desires. And so this chapter is trying to say, you are weighing God in the balances. In other words, you're measuring up God, but you're finding him wanting. You're finding God lacking in what you want. He doesn't seek my comfort at every turn. Well, that's what I want. I want to be, you know all of that. But the bottom line is that you may do that all your life, but the end result is still, or the end goal of all of this is the judgment that God will have of you. He's going to weigh you in the balances because he's given you every reason to keep living for yourself and setting yourself more in stone every day. There's response going to be. As the bronze priest, etc. That's just the way I say he's going to call for his own sorcerers, astrologers, and theologians and that kind of thing. Again, the idea would be he's wanting them to tell him what he wants to hear and to make it all good again. He turns to the gods that he was praising for help, but he's going to find that they're useless, right? Verse 8, as Carter read it, it says, now all the king's horses and all the king's men could not. That's not what it says. It says, all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. So they're useless. And this, of course, goes in harmony with chapter 2, right? Whenever Nebuchadnezzar did the same thing. But the queen, it says in verse 10, is somebody who remembers. And so, Lucas, do you mind doing some reading? Would you read verses 10 through 12?
The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. There is a man in your kingdom who is the spirit of the holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, Chaldeans and soothsayers, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation.
So as I have there on the notes at letter C, so Belshazzar, since his gods, of course, weren't going to help, he has to call for the servant of the very God that he's blaspheming in this feast. Belshazzar has realized that there is no help from his gods, but help can only come from the God who, that's true for all of us. We have to understand that the God that we offend is the God that wants to save us. And that is going to require a humbling of ourselves before him and admitting that we need to change. If you don't mind, I'll have you, he calls Daniel before him and explains that he needs the interpretation of all this. And if you will start at verse 17, start at verse 18. This will be Daniel's interpretation, 18 through 22.
O King, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father the kingdom and majesty, glory and honor. And because of the majesty he gave him, all the peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he held. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Then he was driven from the sons of men, him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the heaven of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this.
Well, there's the essential message, isn't it? You haven't learned the lesson from your grandfather. He learned it twice that we've already read in chapters 2 and 4. At chapters 2, actually he learned it in chapters 2, 3, and 4, but he recorded his conversion experience, so to speak, in chapter 4. And he should have learned this. His sanity and was driven from the presence of men and out into the presence of animals, which is another very important theme in the book of Daniel, that when men begin behaving like animals, it's never good for the people that they rule over. There's a lot of animals described in Daniel, whether visionary or metaphade. Only human beings, only men, not animals, has the ability to experience numinous awe. But we also, because God has given us the freedom, have the ability to reject that numinous awe, to resist it, to try to cover it somehow in order to get on about our own business. And that's the danger, of course, that we have there. Are there any comments on these things? And so in verse 23, Daniel just finishes the sentence or the accusation against the Lord of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know anything. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. It's a pretty lofty statement to bring out God's sovereignty, his authority, his worthiness, about how that he's the one that you're responsible to for the way that you even breathe, every breath that you make, owned by the God of heaven. It's the only reason you're able to breathe is because God is blessing you with a breath. So that should drive us all to him. In the rest of the chapter, and I tell you what, I'll just read this rest of the chapter, and then we'll just be finished without having much comment on it until next time, where we can talk more about the meaning of these things. Verse 24 says, "Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written, Tekel Uparsin. This is the interpretation of each word. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold around his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be third ruler in the kingdom. But that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So that was a revelation on the wall that his days were numbered, his hours were numbered, evidently. This didn't end well. Didn't end like it did with Nebuchadnezzar, at least, where he comes to recognize the greatness of God. He wasn't given a chance. Belshazzar wasn't. Jesus also gave that parable, you don't know. This very night, your soul is required of you. And now what are you going to do with all the things you were hoarding for yourself? You should have been thinking of service to God the whole time. So, it's great reminders, and that's the message there of chapter 5. Like I said, there is more application, and we'll try to do that next time. I appreciate it. We'll be dismissed from class. Get ready for worship. As was announced, we will be starting our new service schedule next week. 9:30 a.m. for Bible class and 10:30 a.m. Got that right, don't I? 10:30 a.m. for worship. And then we will not have a 1:30. Our first Sunday fellowship meal every month is still going to be on that schedule as well. And our Wednesday evening Bible class remains unchanged also. So we're implementing this new schedule. And I hope that I can make it clear enough to you that it is not about diminishing our time together. It is about opening more opportunities for us to spend time together on a personal level, and invite one another to eat together or to spend time during the Sunday lunch together. And primarily, the leaders here of the church, the elders and the deacons have talked about this to some extent, that we want to lead the way. We want to be examples to all of you, and this distinction between, leadership maybe, and those not in that particular capacity, or maybe the phrases could be the strong as opposed to the weak, or the conscientious as opposed to others. It comes from this passage. In this opening in my Bible, as we've been studying the one another passages, I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 one another passages just in the opening. Now I'm talking about my Bible here. It may not be that way with yours. One another anymore. In verse 19 of that chapter, it says, "Let us pursue the things which make for peace and the things by which one may edify another." That is another one of those one another passages, to edify or build up one another. And then the one that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, chapter 15 and verse 5, "Now may the God of patience and comfort grant you to be like-minded toward," verse 7, "Therefore, receive one another, just as Christ also received us." Perhaps a translation could read, "Accept one another." Verse 14 of chapter 15, "Filled with all knowledge, able also to admonish one another." And this is one that is perhaps capable of various translations. Encourage, teach, instruct, warn. That word can be translated those various ways. The word itself has to do with an effort to help a brother from perhaps a negative background, meaning they are in need of a change of path, and you want to help them along that change, but you do it, of course, as a Christian brother or a sister. And so that's a tricky one there. It has to do with confronting in a way that brings honor to Christ and shows the love that you have toward your brothers and sisters. But that's why the word is translated in various ways, because a single English word doesn't seem to get it across. But admonish one another. And then finally, chapter 16 and verse 16, greet one another. So just in this opening, there are many one another passages. And this is what we focused on for the last month or so, on maybe somewhat of a reset, of a reboot, a rededication here at the church. In order to hit the ground running in the next year with a renewed interest and commitment to getting to know one another and serving one another in a way that helps us to be closer, bring cohesion to this congregation and honor to the God who is the greatest example of that. In this passage that Keith read for us this morning shows that. The phrase in verse 7, chapter 15:7, where we're focused now, is to receive one another. Well, this context actually begins in chapter 14, verse 1, when it says, receive one who conscientious scruples. It means receive one another with an effort to be stronger in your relationship with each other. And there are various ways that Paul explains in that chapter and how to do that. And like I said, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago with regard to being of one mind. How can you be of one mind with one another if you have differences of opinions, different ways of accomplishing or approaching a task, or different answers to the same question? How can you be of the same mind? Nobody can be of the same mind, because we're different people. And yet the Bible is telling us to do that. Well, because it's not telling us to have the same opinion. It's telling us to learn how to get along with one another. But it's going to take maturity. It's going to take selflessness. It's going to take a willingness to look to Christ first as an example of someone who was willing to forego his own liberties and his own. The way Paul begins to describe that in the rest of chapter 14 is talking about if you disagree with your brother on something, don't jump to judgment. Don't judge one another. Verse 4 says, who are you to judge another's servant? In other words, that's your brother, that's your sister. This is a brother or sister who's trying to be a Christian too. And so don't go at it like you're trying to defend yourself in everything. And the converse is true also. In other words, Paul talks about both the strong and the weak in these passages. And then on the other hand, if you're the other party, don't be a snowflake and melt every time something doesn't go your way. You would have no salvation. Often. We either want to put up the dukes and go to boxing the other person, or we want to just wilt before them and melt and then complain and then cause division and backbiting and gossip. And brothers and sisters, I'm just trying to get the point across here that does nothing but destroy the body of Christ. And then whoever destroys the body of Christ, God will destroy him. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, 16 and 17. And that's why the strong and the weak have this responsibility to take a step back and assess their relationship with their brothers and sisters in light of Jesus, in light of the Lord. Verse 9 of this chapter, Romans 14:9 says, for to this end Christ died and rose and lived again, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. But why do you judge your brother? Why do you show contempt for your brother? We are all going to be standing before the judgment seat of Christ. He's the one who is going to make the final determination. And I know what he said in many of his parables. If you cannot forgive your brother from your heart, God is not going to forgive you either. And so we all need to mature, and we all need to grow up and say, I've got a role to play in this place. I need to commit myself because the Lord died for me. The Lord died for everybody in this room. And there are, I'm assuming everybody in this room has, and that gives you not only great privileges and great blessings, but great responsibility as a Christian. Grow spiritually. And I need my brothers and sisters' help. And whenever I start fighting and backbiting and gossiping behind the scenes about my brothers and sisters, I'm only destroying myself because I'm destroying the church. So Paul says, therefore receive one another, just as Christ also received us to the glory of God. The more immediate context, which is our second point here, begins in chapter 15, verse 1, where he's summarizing what he's said in chapter 14, to not destroy the work of God for the sake of your own desires, verse 20. He says in verse 15, as somewhat of a conclusion of that, we then, who are strong, ought to bear with the scruples of the weak and not to please ourselves. So this is where sacrificing your own comforts and your own liberties, really, for the good of others comes into play. Because if Jesus didn't do that, then you wouldn't have any hope. Verse 2 says, let us, instead of pleasing ourselves, let us please his neighbor. See, that's the entirely opposite direction. Instead of tearing down and being selfish, it's about pleasing the other in order to build up. And then, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. Now, that is a citation from the Old Testament. And it's applied to Jesus, of course. There were, of course, those sinners and rebels against the God of heaven reproaching him in rebellion. But Jesus, instead, he stands in front of God's wrath against them and says, let that fall on me. That's self-sacrifice. I will receive the reproaches. I will bear the reproaches, and then you can treat me with the justice that they deserve. That's self-sacrifice. And Jesus was willing to do that. And of course, a life that is characterized by that kind of love, commitment, sacrifice, is the most blessed life ever. Jesus, who for the glory that was set before him, endured the cross, despised the throne of God. He is exalted to the highest place of life. He sacrificed the most that could ever be sacrificed. And God's just putting that life before you, saying, do you want to have the abundant life? Do that is give of yourself all that you can. Say, I'm willing to lay bare my neck on behalf of other people around me. and I'm willing to entrust my life to the God of heaven. Jesus is the great trailblazer. He's the one who's shown us that path, and we can follow him. And it's may have life, and that they may have it more abundantly. The abundant life is the life that is lived in complete devotion to Jesus. And so that's what we hope to encourage in one another. That we who are strong ought to seek to encourage and help and fellowship and spend time with those who are weak. Now again, you have to stop and think, am I the strong or am I the weak? Well, at first, nobody really thinks they're the weak. Whenever you have an opinion, whenever you have a thought, you don't think, well, this is my opinion, this is my thought, but it's wrong. You don't think that. It's not the nature of the way it works. But it takes a special kind of maturity to be able to be spiritual enough, objective enough to step back and say, wait, I am weak. And I may very well be the weak one in this situation. You see how God seems to always turn everything onto its head. The way to glory is through humiliation. The way up is down. The way to conquer is to fall on your knees and beg for mercy from God. This is just the way Jesus taught us. It will not be so among you like it is among the Gentiles, for they honor their great ones, and they kiss the ring, and they bow at the feet of their great ones, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it will not be that way among you. Whoever wants to be greatest among you, let him be the least. Let him be the servant. If you want to be master, then become the servant. And then God will exalt you in the proper time, in a way that is eternally rewarding to you. And you can bask in his glory forever and ever. Therefore, receive one another, brothers and sisters, just as Christ also received us to the glory of God. We're going to sing a song of invitation at this time. If anyone needs to respond in a public way, come forward while together we stand and sing.